Welcome to the Oklahoma Department of Corrections Annual Volunteer Training. My name is Leo Brown. I am the Agency Chaplain and Volunteer Administrator for the Oklahoma Department of Corrections. And we've designed this PowerPoint-based training video to provide current volunteers with the reminders, refreshers, and tools to continue serving safely and effectively. This video fulfills our agency's requirement for annual training, as well as those of the American Correctional Association. But before we begin, we want you to know how much we appreciate your volunteer service. Our agency's focus is summed up in the phrase, "We change lives." We recognize we cannot live up to that calling without the impact of our volunteers. On a daily basis, you are making a difference. The vast majority of our volunteers are providing inmates with opportunities that can lead to positive life change. You are making a difference in the lives of those incarcerated, their families, our staff, our facilities, and the state. And we just want to say thank you. It is our hope that this training will enable you to continue to serve effectively and safely in an environment that can be very challenging. Now, before we get into the training, we want you to know what to expect and what to do when you have completed this training. This training video is a little over an hour long. Because it is a video-based training, it gives you some flexibility as you go through it. You can pause the video if you need to take a break. Or if there's a slide that you would like to look at a little bit longer, you can pause it there too. If you need to go back and watch something again to make sure that you understand it correctly, you can do that. The important thing is that we want you to get as much as possible out of this training. Now, this training is presented on an honor system. It is required that you watch the entire video, and you'll have to sign a document afterwards saying that you've done so. After watching this video, you will need to complete and sign documentation for the training. Now, those documents are attached to the email you received from your primary facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator, the one that had the link to this video. You will need to print those documents, complete them, and submit them to your primary facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator. Now, you can submit them either by scanning them into a PDF document and attaching them to an email, or you can make copies and mail the originals to the facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator, or you can just take them to the facility and hand deliver them. We do ask, however, that you do not email photos of the documents. In this way, you'll be able to complete the training process and continue serving as a volunteer with the Oklahoma Department of Corrections. If you have any questions about the information in this training video or about the annual training process, please feel free to contact the primary facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator, the one that emailed you this information. Now for the training outline. These are the topics covered in this annual volunteer training. We will discuss the code of conduct. We will go over the rules for volunteer service. We'll discuss volunteer awareness and communication, how important that is in your volunteer service with the Oklahoma Department of Corrections. As mandated by federal statute, we will cover Pria. We will also discuss suicide awareness and prevention and emergency procedures. So begin by looking at the Oklahoma Department of Corrections Volunteer Code of Conduct. The Volunteer Code of Conduct, as well as the rules for volunteer service, are found in OP-090211. It's our policy entitled Volunteer Services. Now that policy states in the opening portion that we view our volunteers as partners with our agency. As partners, volunteers are expected to maintain a standard of conduct that upholds the public trust and reflects the highest ethical standards. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections Volunteer Code of Conduct. This code of conduct is a set of broad principles upon which the rules for volunteer service are based. And you'll see that as we go through the remainder of this training. The code of conduct are made up of 8 statements. Number 1, volunteers will devote full attention and effort to their work and responsibilities while performing their volunteer service. Number 2, volunteers are to engage in conduct that affords respect, courtesy, and preserves the dignity of others. Number 3, volunteers are to refrain from conduct which is corrupt, illegal, serves to denigrate, demean, or disregard the welfare of others. Number 4, volunteers are to promote and model exemplary behavior. Number 5, volunteers are to comply with all laws, rules, regulations, agency policies, and procedures that apply to any aspect of volunteer service. Number 6, volunteers are to avoid any conduct, interest, or relationship that is in conflict with or detrimental to proper and effective service as a volunteer. Number 7, volunteers are to serve in a manner which contributes to and supports a safe and healthful environment. And finally, number 8, volunteers are to promptly and truthfully report any actions which are not in accordance with agency policies and procedures, violate volunteer rules and guidelines, endanger others, or undermines the value of the agencies. Any volunteer whose actions violate this code of conduct may be subject to discipline in accordance with our policy, OP-090211. Now let's begin looking at the rules for volunteer service. These rules are based upon the code of conduct we just discussed. The first set of rules are these. It is always important to follow staff instructions. Now there are 2 reasons for this. First, it's for your own safety. There may be things going on that you're not aware of. If an officer interrupts your activity or meeting and tells all the inmates to go back to their housing unit, it is not the time to argue, question, or try to postpone. There may be things going on that you're unaware of, and we may need to secure the facility and you as quickly as possible. Secondly, it is important that you set an example for those incarcerated to follow. They're looking at you. One of the most important things a volunteer can do is be a role model. So how you respond to the directions that staff give you and the respect that you show the officers will be an example to the offenders that you work with. Now afterward, if you believe the situation could have been handled better or the instructions that you were given were unnecessary or counterproductive, please let us know. We know we're not perfect. When we make mistakes, we want to learn from those mistakes so we can do better next time. But in the moment, it is always important to follow the instructions that staff give you, whoever staff may be, as quickly as possible. Now we want to remind you of the rules concerning volunteer ID cards. Each volunteer is issued 2 IDs. And of course, as you know, one of them is not a spare. You have to have 2 IDs so that you can leave one at Central Control and wear the other while you're at the facility. You must wear your ID card whenever you're inside an Oklahoma Department of Corrections facility. You also need to wear your ID card if you're picking up inmates at community corrections for transportation to a program or activity or other type of event. You must also wear your ID card the entire time you're serving at an off-site activity that might be attended by inmates. So what do you do if you lose your volunteer ID? Well, the first thing you do is to notify our Volunteer Services office here in Oklahoma City. You'll also need to notify the facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator at the last facility you visited. It's possible they may have found your ID or if it may have been left there at Central Control. If you do lose or forget where you placed your badge, you can have your group leader, program leader contact the facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator at the facility where you're serving as a volunteer, and they may be able to get permission for you to come in with your driver's license as ID until we're able to get you a new volunteer ID card. And of course, every 2 years, you do need to update and renew your volunteer ID. You will be contacted by our Volunteer Services office when that time approaches with instructions on how to do just that. From time to time, we get questions regarding how a volunteer is supposed to dress when they're providing volunteer services, especially inside one of our facilities. While there is no standard dress code within our volunteer policy. And volunteers are not to be held to the same dress code that employees are. There are certain types of dress that we believe that you should refrain from and we do not allow. Sleeveless shirts, halter tops, tank tops, low-cut tops, of course camouflage clothing. We don't want you to wear anything that might confuse you with inmates. In other words, don't wear the same colors that inmates are wearing. No short shorts, nothing above the knee, or short dresses that are above the knee. No flip-flops or open-toed shoes are allowed. Of course, we just want you to wear dress that is appropriate, not sexualized in any way. And no t-shirts or anything else that might have offensive messages on it. It is very important that volunteers arrive and depart as scheduled. Now, when you're to arrive at a facility, how far in advance of your scheduled volunteer activity, meeting, or service that you need to arrive at the facility will vary based upon the facility. Some will need you there earlier to get you processed through their screening process. Others will want you to arrive closer to the time that your activity is actually supposed to start. Regardless, it's important that you arrive at the scheduled time when you're supposed to arrive and that you depart as scheduled. It's equally important that you end your service or activity when it's scheduled to end. Our facilities, the vast majority of them, have very tight schedules. There may be other meetings scheduled in that room that you're using, and it's quite likely that there will be other things that those who are in your meetings, the inmates that are in your meetings, need to do, whether it's dining hall or another activity, that they have to go to as soon as your meeting is over. So it's really important that you begin and end on time. Always, of course, remember that you enter into a facility and exit from a facility from central control. Whenever you come to an Oklahoma Department of Corrections, you must be prepared to be searched. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections is authorized to search any persons, any bags that come into a facility, or any vehicles on the grounds. And this includes not just coming into a facility to hold services or activities inside the facility, but also picking up those inmates at community correctional facilities and bring them to outside events. Always be prepared to be searched. Please check your pockets carefully before you get to central control. Please make sure that any bags that you're bringing in, you're aware of what's in the bags, and everything within those bags has been authorized and is allowed. And if you have any vehicles that are being parked on the grounds, please understand that those are also subject to search. If you have anything within your vehicles that could be considered weapons, they need to be left at home. So now let's talk about what you can and cannot bring into a correctional facility. Do not bring any contraband into a correctional facility or to an off-site center activity involving an inmate. Now, we do define contraband in a policy, but a simple definition is this. Contraband is anything that is not specifically allowed. In other words, we cannot give you a list of what is contraband. If it's not allowed, then it is contraband. There are some kinds of contraband that are more serious than others. Weapons is obviously one. It is not only illegal to bring a weapon into a correctional facility, it is also illegal just to have a weapon in your vehicle when you come onto facility grounds. So you always have to make sure what is in your car in addition to what's in your pockets or your bags when you come in. You cannot have anything that can be considered a weapon. Cameras and video equipment have to be authorized in advance by the facility head in order to be brought into the facility. Cell phones are some of the most dangerous types of contraband that we currently have. Cell phones can be used and has been used to commit numerous types of criminal activity and violence within our prisons. It is incredibly important that cell phones are not brought into the facility, and therefore it has been made a felony to bring an unauthorized cell phone into a correctional facility. Here's a question that we're often asked. What if there are medications that I need to take at the time in which I'm scheduled to be volunteering inside a correctional facility? Well, if you'll contact your facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator, they can likely make arrangements to get that approved for you to bring in just the dosage that you need for that period of time while you're inside the correctional facility. It's also important to remember that even program material and items that you might want to donate to the facility must be approved in advance. You can request that approval from the facility chaplain and volunteer coordinator, but all those items must be approved in advance before they are brought to the facility. Now, volunteers are only allowed to go to the specifically designated locations in the facility for the activity that you or they provide at that time. You're to proceed directly from central control to your activity or program site and directly back afterwards. It is really important that security knows where you are at any given time, and the only way they're going to be able to know that is if you are where you are scheduled to be. One of the most common mistakes that volunteers make is to get into a situation where they are placing money on an inmate's trust fund, their books, or giving money to an inmate's family. That is a direct violation of volunteer rules. You cannot put money on inmates' books. You cannot give or receive money or anything of value to an inmate or inmate's family. You cannot give money to an inmate's family or friends. You cannot sell products or services to an inmate. If you see an inmate in need or believe there might be a need that you would like to help with, there may be a way that you can do that, but you must communicate with the facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator. They will verify the need that the inmate has or that he's told you about, and together you might be able to find a way that through your volunteer organization or your faith community, you might be able to assist with that need. But it must be coordinated through the facility chaplain and volunteer coordinator, and you cannot give money or anything of value directly or receive money or anything of value directly from an inmate. Some people think that volunteers are not allowed to correspond with inmates, and that used to be the case. But now the rules allow volunteers to correspond with inmates either through mail, through the messaging system that's set up in Securus, as long as you do so in ways that comply with the rules regarding your interactions with them when you're in person. So in other words, here's some key rules. One, of course, you cannot use any language that is romantic or sexual in nature. Two, you cannot pass information from other inmates that you might be working with, or ex-offenders on the outside, or family or friends. You cannot pass that information to the inmates. Number three, you cannot have correspondence from a former inmate with a current inmate. In other words, if you're an ex-offender serving as a volunteer, the restrictions that you have in corresponding with inmates supersedes those of your ability to do so as a volunteer. Some of the best practices to remember is that all correspondence is being reviewed by staff at the facility. Be positive in your concepts, the ideas, the letters that you send to them. Be professional in everything you do. Avoid anything that be conceived as derogatory language towards the agency or individuals, and avoid any ambiguous language. Some of the things we sometimes get concerned about or raises red flags with some folks is ending a letter with saying, for instance, love you or love you in the Lord. Well, that can mean one thing to someone in a religious context, but it can mean something very different for someone that is objectively reading the letter. So please be sure you're careful about the language you use when you write or correspond with inmates. The next few slides are going to be covering volunteering in community correctional settings where you're able to pick up inmates and transport them to an off-site location for religious services, support groups, other types of programmatic activity, or even to funerals and other types of needs that the inmate might have. First of all, those who are doing the transporting, those who are doing the driving, must have 0 points on their driving record. Secondly, You have to have at least one Department of Corrections volunteer for every 8 inmates that you're going to be supervising on that off-site activity. Third, you have to have at least one DOC volunteer of the same gender when you pick up the inmates. In other words, you've got to have, if it's a male facility, you have to have at least one male person in the team that picks up the inmates from the community correctional center. 3, you're expected to report to security office when you're signing in and signing out for those activities. This is especially important. Of course, you'll have to report to security to sign them out when you pick them up to take them off site. But it's really important when you get back to make sure that you escort the inmates back to Central Control and sign them back in from that activity when they're done. Next, you can only allow to transport in vehicles that, of course, are insured and registered. And then finally, you've got to make sure that you don't take any stops, any extra stops, whether it's a fast food restaurant or personal address. No extra stops are allowed when you're transporting inmates. You must only go to the approved locations and destinations that the facility has authorized. Now, in the unlikely event that you are involved in an accident while transporting inmates, we want you to know what to do. First of all, take a moment to assess the situation. Are people hurt? Are there any immediate threats, like traffic, for instance, that you need to be concerned about? And what is the damage that's been done? Secondly, call 911 and the facility to report the accident. Now, when you call 911, make sure that you identify yourself as an Oklahoma Department of Corrections volunteers and let them know that you're transporting inmates. If there's any life-threatening injuries, provide that information and details and that type of thing. Letting them know that you're transporting inmates, well, for one, it will probably speed up the response time. And secondly, it will allow those on the other end to make judgment calls as regarding who should be sent. The facility also will need to know so that they will be able to coordinate their response as well. Do not leave the scene until you're authorized to do so, either by the facility or by those who respond to your 911 call. And finally, you will be submitted to submit an incident report, a written one, to the security staff at the facility as soon as possible. If an inmate becomes sick or abusive verbally or violent, you are to call the facility, and then if it's an emergency situation you feel is developing, call 911. Provide medical assistance, of course, at the location that you might be able to provide at your activity location and as you're qualified to do so. The main thing is we don't want you to put yourself in jeopardy. So do not engage in a physical altercation, and if violence does erupt, do not become involved in it yourself. Call 911, call the facility, and get help. Similarly, if an inmate flees or attempts to leave your program site while you're away from the facility, you are not to try to chase them down or physically try to restrain them. Certainly, we hope that you would try to talk them out of leaving, but we don't want you putting yourself at risk. So do not engage in physical efforts to try to restrain them from leaving. If they do, leave your facility, leave your program site in an unauthorized way. If they flee, then you are to immediately call the facility and give them that information, and they will instruct you further what to do. We do want to remind you some of the things that you cannot do, inmates are not allowed to do during off-site activities. Some of these are obvious and some of these are not. But first of all, you cannot, of course, allow them to engage in sexual activities. They're not allowed to use the internet, so make sure that they don't have access to computers, tablets, or smartphones. They cannot make any phone calls of any kind. Remember, even though they are at a community correctional center and they are be taken off-site for your program or activity, they are still considered incarcerated, and phone calls are all monitored through the facility, so they are not allowed to make phone calls. You might also need to prepare the other people that are not DOC volunteers that might be at those activities, support groups, meetings, whatever they might be, so that they will know how to respond if an inmate asks them, "Can I borrow your phone?" They cannot do that. Of course, they're not allowed to engage in drug use while they're off site. They're not allowed to use social media of any kind. They're not to have time alone with their family. Now, your program and your group, your organization can certainly allow the inmate's family to be there to participate. For instance, if it's a religious service and you want the inmate's family to be able to participate in that religious service along with the inmates, that is perfectly fine. But you must provide supervision the whole time they're together, and they're not to be allowed to have time alone together. They're not to receive any alcohol while they're off-site, and finally, they're not allowed to mail any items. Again, all their correspondence has to be monitored through the facility that they are a part of. I've often said that it's more challenging to serve as a volunteer at the lower security levels. And that's because at the higher security levels, maximum security and medium security, it's maybe more challenging to get in. You have to go through all those searches. You have to a lot more locks and doors and security restrictions you have to go through, and a lot more rules you have to follow while you're inside the facility. But at the same time, because of those rules, because of those security precautions, there are less things that can go wrong. The lower the security level you go, the more freedom the inmates have, the more things can go wrong. So when you get to community corrections, when you're actually picking up inmates and bringing them to an off-site location, it is, I believe, the most challenging place to serve because of the level of supervision that you need to provide to ensure that the rules are being followed and that nothing inappropriate is happening. So please make sure that you're being diligent to monitor their activities. We certainly want them to benefit from all of the positive things that you're exposing them to while they're off-site. But at the same time, we have to make sure that none of the rules for off-site activities are being violated. We used to have a lot of rules regarding the interactions volunteers could have with inmates after they were released from incarceration. And we've done away with almost all of those because we want to encourage and support volunteers helping to be that bridge that inmates can help inmates successfully transition back into society. The only continuing restrictions we have for volunteers working with those after they get released from prison is in regard to employment. And this is just to ensure that both inmates and volunteers, ex-offenders and volunteers, are all protected and no one's being taken advantage of. So it's basically this, that if you are wanting to hire an ex-offender, you can do so as long as you're doing it through a nonprofit or a business. You cannot hire them personally to do stuff around the house and that type of thing, or lawn care and that type of thing for 180 days after they are released from a facility. If you are engaged in a volunteer effort, a nonprofit or a business that hires volunteers, we would like for you to let the facility know that you have that connection and that you're in the process of employing inmates. And of course, any employment, especially if it's someone who is at community corrections level working off-site, must follow all the rules and guidelines for work release. In recent years, we felt the need to share some guidelines and some guidance for volunteers on what is appropriate for them to share on social media related to their volunteer service. And just as a basis of understanding, by social media, we're talking about those websites and applications that focus on communication, community-based input, interaction, collaboration, content sharing. Websites like platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, and YouTube. Now, we're not trying to discourage volunteers' use of social media or control what they do with social media, except for just to provide some guidelines on what is appropriate to share on social media related to their volunteer service. We know that the vast majority of Americans get much of their information and community interaction and support from social media. And so we just want to let you know what's appropriate to share as it relates to your service as a volunteer with the Department of Corrections. Here's some guidelines. For instance, What about posting pictures of offenders without the expressed authorization of the Oklahoma Department of Corrections? Is that appropriate? Of course, no. Now, there are ways to go about getting approval for for taking photos of inmates and utilizing them in specific ways, but without that authorization, you cannot take pictures to begin with, but then you certainly cannot utilize them on social media without that permission. What about using social media to recruit for your volunteer group? Absolutely. We want you to be able to utilize social media to recruit volunteers for your group and to raise support for your group. How about using social media as a way to pass along messages to inmates or information from inmates to those on the outside? As you can imagine, that is not allowed. You're not allowed to use social media to pass along any messages from inmates to those outside or trying to get information to inmates for that regard. Please do not ever try to present yourself as speaking on behalf of the Department of Corrections. When you post something on social media, make sure that people understand that you're not an employee of Department of Corrections and you don't speak on behalf of them. If it's sharing something about your volunteer service, clearly identify yourself as a volunteer with the Department of Corrections and that you're speaking out of your own personal experience and opinion, not on behalf of the agency. What about sharing articles and media pictures from our website? Sure, absolutely. That's information and content that we've already screened and we've posted on our website, so by all means feel free to share that on your social media. And of course, you cannot post sensitive information regarding inmate, staff, or facility. Sensitive information might be personal information, issues that are going on with them or at a facility. Please, you cannot post sensitive information regarding inmate, staff, or a facility. And do not engage with friends or family of an inmate with your from your volunteer group on social media. In other words, if you become aware that an inmate that your volunteer group is working with or that you're working with as a volunteer has friends or family on social media, you are not allowed to engage with them because it would be too easy for you to be seen then as an intermediary, as a go-between between the family and the inmate. One of the things to remember about social media is that when something is posted, you may try to take it down, but it is permanent. Um, it will become forever on social media. And that's why we want to make sure that anything that you might say or post on social media is accurate and you have the information, the correct information that you need. Always be mindful of what you post. And if you're posting something about the agency, please verify that it is accurate before you post it. If you have questions about what's going on at a facility or with a particular inmate, please ask those questions before you start posting anything on social media. Once it's posted, even if it's false or inaccurate, it is so difficult to try to correct. So we just want to make sure that you're able to post, if you do post information, that it is accurate information. And again, the best thing to do about social media is before you post, make sure you really don't mind it staying out there forever. Used to be that if we did something stupid, we could kind of put it behind us. People would forget. On the internet, it never forgets. So please make sure that anything you post, think about it, make sure it's what you really want out there for all time and for everyone to see before you post it. One of the unique aspects about serving as a volunteer with the Oklahoma Department of Corrections is the diverse population that you're able to work with. In our agency, within our inmate population, we have over 100 different faiths represented. As a state agency, we have to maintain equality. In other words, we cannot show preference to one religion over another or to religion over non-religion or non-religion over religion. We have to maintain an equal accommodations, equal approach towards all faith groups. And there's therefore also some rules that religious volunteers need to adhere to and be mindful of if you're providing religious services inside a correctional facility. You have to make sure that you're treating all groups with respect. In other words, all those providing religious services are expected to treat other religious groups with respect. You may not agree with their beliefs. You may find some of their beliefs and practices disturbing, but you have to treat them with respect. You have to learn how to be positive about what you believe without being negative about what other people believe or do in regard to their faith. An example, uh, it's not appropriate to say within a correctional setting, within a correctional facility, all the pagans are going to hell. Because we have pagan as a religion and different forms of paganism practice within our correctional facilities. Now, what you can say as a Christian, if you want to say this, you could say, Jesus is the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through him. You see, that's an example of how you can be positive about what you believe without being derogatory about another person's beliefs or practices. We also have to be mindful that our volunteer rules specifically restrict people from using derogatory language when referring to other groups or people advocating religious, racial, or national hatred. Anyone who violates that prohibition may be suspended from providing religious services going forward. Another thing to keep in mind is that all of our meetings spaces can be used by any religious group, any practices of any practice. So you may be utilizing that for your group at one time, and there might be someone else coming in right after you or right before you, utilizing that space, the same space for their faith group. We cannot have any designated space for a specific religious group, other than some of our outdoor areas that mandate that. If you have religious special events, they can be requested in advance through the facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator and must be requested at least 60 to 90 days in advance. Finally, for this section of the training, we want to review some of the reporting requirements that we have for volunteers. You're required to report any potential threat to the Oklahoma Department of Corrections facility or staff member. If you hear of anyone planning anything or any potential threat, then you're required to report that. You're required to report any inmate emergency. If you are arrested or charged with a crime, you're required to report that, as well as if you get involved in an accident or tickets that add points to your driving record, you're required to report that as well. If you have a family member or a friend incarcerated, then you need to report that. And if you request to be placed on an inmate's visiting list, then you need to report that to the facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator where that inmate might be. We just covered many of the most important rules for volunteer service. We'll be touching base on them again later on in the training, but it's important for you to know that any actions by a volunteer that violate the code of conduct or rules for volunteer service may be subject to disciplinary action in accordance with our policy OP-090211, which is volunteer services, and could lead to suspension or revocation of your volunteer status. In this next section of training, we will discuss volunteer awareness and communication. This primarily relates to how to avoid con games, how to avoid being manipulated by those you're working with, and how to communicate effectively and clearly in a correctional setting. We begin with a quote from James Gondels Jr., Executive Director of the American Correctional Association, who happens to be from Oklahoma, by the way. He said that sometimes correctional officers, probation and parole officers, and other staff, including volunteers, fall victim to the manipulation and con games of inmates. What may seem like an innocent request from a friendly, cooperative inmate can lead to staff compromising their positions and the policies of the agency. Certainly, that also applies to volunteers and the work you do with those incarcerated on a daily basis. You know, we face the potential of being manipulated on a daily basis, and not just in prison, working with those incarcerated. It could be just about anywhere where you're engaging with people, whether it be in business, whether it be at your work, whether it be in purchasing items, or even in your families. Manipulation is a constant challenge that we have to deal with. And there really is an art to manipulation, and there are people who have developed that art to a great skill. I think the keys into protecting ourselves against manipulation start with an understanding of what it really is. So the definition of to manipulate, it means to control or to play upon someone by artful or unfair means, especially to one's own advantage. So how do we avoid being manipulated? Well, there is not a foolproof method, but there are some keys that we want to share with you that we believe will help you can help us avoid manipulation. Here are some keys. First of all, it's so important to understand the danger. Most people that are being manipulated don't even realize that they are. They don't understand the threat of being manipulated. And that's the first step, is especially when you're working in a correctional setting, always have your sensors out, always have your guard up to the danger of someone trying to manipulate you to get you to do something that you shouldn't be doing or that you may not want to do. Secondly, make sure you understand that manipulation is a slippery slope. People who try to manipulate you will not start out asking you to do something that they know you won't do. They will typically start out asking you to do something or trying to get you to do something that you're more likely to do, a small step. And then they will use that to get you on a slippery slope that will take you down to finally you're doing something that you may never thought you would have at the beginning. Most of our staff or volunteers who have been trapped and manipulated into bringing in contraband fall into this category. They have been manipulated by first doing little things that were policy violations, and then step by step by step, the inmate gets them into doing something they never thought they would at the beginning. To stay off the slippery slope and to to help you be aware if you begin to get on that slope, there are red flags. And we want you to understand what those are. Now, red flags, of course, are things that hopefully will stand out in your mind or trigger an awareness that something may be going on that isn't right. Now, red flags can take the form of either actions or thoughts. Give you an example. Some of the actions that might be a red flag that someone is trying to manipulate you might be over-flattering. If they're telling you something that is flattering or trying to butter you up, that might be, now not necessarily always, but it might be a red flag to someone trying to manipulate you. Also, a red flag might be someone just asking you to do something really small that you're not really sure you're allowed to do, or it might be a small violation of policy, but they're just saying, can you just do this little thing for me? Actions might be someone trying to isolate you from the group as a whole, maybe wanting to talk to you privately about something and that type of thing. Actions can also be someone trying to play on your motivations or your sympathy. Sometimes people who try to manipulate you will do so by playing on your kindness or by appealing to maybe a situation that they know will tend to make you do something that you might not want to do because you care and you're compassionate. Those are all actions that should be red flags. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are trying to manipulate you, but it means they might be. And then thoughts. Thoughts are things that go through your own mind that should be red flags that you need to stop and think, whoa, maybe I'm going down a wrong path here. Thoughts like, for instance, well, it may be against policy, but is it really wrong? Or, really, is it that bad? Or what difference does it make? That type of thing. The actions, the thoughts that we should be having is pretty simple. Is something an inmate's requesting us to do, is it allowed under policy, and are we sure that it's allowed under policy? If we begin to have thoughts like, well, what harm could it do, for instance, if I do this? Or, well, I'm not sure it's allowed, but it probably is. I could just do it anyway. Or maybe, but they have such a big need. I should do this even though it's a small violation of policy. There are no small violations of the rules. The rules are there to protect you and to protect the inmates and the facility. If you begin having those kind of thoughts, those are huge red flags that you need to stop, ask one of your team members, your group leader, or the facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator for guidance. So here's some other keys to avoiding manipulation. You've got to be able to say no. Volunteers to serve safely and effectively within the Department of Corrections must be able to say no, I can't do that. No, that's not allowed under policy. No, we're not allowed to do that. Now, there may be times, I'm sure there probably will be times, when you're maybe not sure if something an inmate is asking you to do is allowed. Well, we've got a magic phrase we'd like to share with you. You probably remember it from your early trainings, but we just want to reiterate it and refresh it to your mind. And that is, you can always tell the inmate, I don't know, but I will ask the chaplain. Or I don't know, but let me ask the volunteer coordinator if you're at a community facility. And that will cut through so much right there. Now, they may say, well, that'd be great. Maybe you can help do that. Or they might say, no, don't ask the chaplain. Please don't ask the chaplain. Whatever it might be, that will ensure that you're not being manipulated and that you're on the right path. Another key to avoiding manipulation is clear communication skills. And we're going to be talking about that over the next few slides. Effective communication is an important tool in avoiding manipulation. Here are some suggestions on ways that you can maintain the right kind of relationship with those that you work with inside the prison. First of all, communication dues. We want you to be, please do be fair, firm, and impartial. Be polite but not personal with inmates. Enforce the rules strictly and consistently. It's so important to be a good listener. We've talked about the do's. Let's now just cover a few don'ts if you're trying to maintain the appropriate relationship with inmates in your communication. Don'ts. Don't use profanity or inmate slang. Secondly, do not discuss personal information with inmates. Do not discuss other inmates, staff, or volunteers with an inmate. And do not promise confidence or secrecy to an inmate beyond what you're able to give them. One of the most dangerous forms of manipulation is that which leads to sexual exploitation. We've had staff and volunteers fall victim to inmates who have manipulated them into inappropriate relationships. Now, after a careful study of past sexual misconduct cases, we've identified certain characteristics with inmates who are prone to set up staff or employees. We want you to be aware of them. You may find the inmate appears to act differently than a majority of other inmates. They typically will have good social skills and act in a perceptive, subdued, or sensitive manner. Normally, they're a high achiever, and they're typically not a behavioral problem. Like a lot of those incarcerated, they will typically also have a history of substance abuse. So we've also identified certain characteristics that are associated with staff or volunteers who have been manipulated or set up by inmates into inappropriate relationships. We share them with you so they might serve as red flags. First of all, oftentimes these are staff or volunteers who are personally distressed. They might be going through a period where they feel detached from peers or undervalued. They might have relationship problems with a spouse or significant other. Oftentimes they're going through periods of financial strain. They might be just generally dissatisfied with circumstances of life at that point in time. And they might, by nature, be a rescuer, someone who is maybe a little overly naive, gullible, or friendly. Inappropriate relationships between inmates and staff or volunteers may develop as a result of inmate manipulation, but they can also develop simply as a result of getting to know and work with inmates on a regular basis. In either case, we must be aware of the risk and warning signs for ourselves and for other volunteers on our team. Here's a list of what we call the dangerous dozen. They're warning signs for inappropriate relationships that may be developing. Number one, if you find yourself looking forward to seeing a particular inmate when you come to serve as a volunteer. Number two, doing things with an inmate you would not want your family to know about. Number three, being reluctant to have a coworker, another volunteer, or staff member observe your behavior. Number four, talking about personal matters with an inmate. Number five, asking an inmate to do personal favors for you. Number six, receiving personal advice from an inmate. Number seven, saying anything to an inmate you would not want to have tape recorded. Number eight, if you have fantasies about an inmate or maybe about a relationship you might want to have with an inmate. Number nine, believing that you have the right to touch an inmate whenever and wherever you want. Number 10, looking forward to sharing good or bad news with a particular inmate. Number 11, thinking that inmates are not allowed to say no to you no matter what you may ask of them. And finally, number 12, allowing inmates to talk about sexual experiences or sexual fantasies or telling sexual jokes in your presence. If you find in your own behavior or the behavior of one of the volunteers on your team any of these risks or red flags, please say something to them, say something to your group leader, say something to your facility chaplain or volunteer. Do not put yourself at risk of being involved in an inappropriate relationship with an inmate. We will now move on to a somewhat related topic, which is also the only portion of this training that is federally mandated. In 2003, Congress unanimously passed and President George W. Bush signed the Prison Rape Elimination Act, otherwise known as Pria. This legislation set up the process to establish national standards with the goals of reducing and hopefully eliminating the sexual abuse and harassment of those incarcerated, of ensuring sexual abuse and harassment is reported when it occurs, and that the incarcerated victims of sexual abuse are provided the treatment and help that they need. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections has established its own policy under the PRIA guidelines and maintains a zero tolerance toward all forms of sexual abuse and harassment between employees, volunteers, contractors, and those incarcerated. PRIA was covered in much more detail in your new volunteer training, but for this annual training, we just want to remind everyone what constitutes a PRIA violation and what are your responsibilities as a volunteer with the Oklahoma Department of Corrections related to PRIA. So first of all, what constitutes a PRIA violation? Sexual harassment of any kind would constitute a PRIA violation. Any consensual or non-consensual sexually oriented physical contact with inmates by staff, volunteers, vendors, or contractors constitutes a PRIA violation. Any non-consensual sexually oriented physical contact between two inmates constitutes a PRIA violation. It is important to note that consensual sexual activity between inmates is a policy violation, but it is not a PRIA violation. So what are the responsibilities of an Oklahoma Department of Corrections volunteer related to PRIA? Well, there are three simple things to remember. First of all, be aware. Understand what PRIA is and what constitutes a potential PRIA violation, which is why we've included the previous slide in this annual training discussion. Secondly, be alert. Watch for any warning signs and be open to any inmate that wants to talk. We have found that sometimes those who are incarcerated and have been the victim of a sexual abuse are more willing to talk to volunteers because of the relationship you have developed with them than they are staff. So if someone wants to talk, be aware of that. If there are warning signs, if you see an inmate that has changed their behavior in any way significantly or maybe is troubled, be open to them and what they might want to talk about. And finally, report. If you become aware of any Pria violation, you have a responsibility to report it immediately, either to facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator if they're present, or to the security staff that are on site if the chaplain or volunteer coordinator are not available. And of course, remember, this is another way in which you can make a difference by helping us eliminate prison rape in Oklahoma. In this next section, we will briefly discuss suicide awareness and prevention. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections is committed to doing everything we possibly can to prevent inmate suicide. One of the most important things we can do is to ensure that all those who work with inmates are aware of the danger, the risk factors, and the warning signs. This is part of an annual training that we have historically done with staff and have now included in this annual training for volunteers. Understanding the risk factors helps us to identify those who might be more likely to attempt suicide, and therefore to be even more watchful for the warning signs that might be evident in their behavior. So here are the risk factors, things that research has indicated place a person at a greater risk for attempting suicide. First of all, incarceration itself is a high risk factor. Those who are incarcerated, just by the very nature of being incarcerated, are at a higher risk of suicide. As far as gender goes, men are at a higher risk for suicide than women. Regarding sexual orientation, those who are not heterosexual have a 40% higher rate of suicide. If somebody has a history of military service, they have a 21% higher rate of suicide attempts. If someone has a history of trauma, research has shown that that increases their risk of suicide. If they're serving a lengthy sentence, that itself also increases their risk of suicide. Some other risk factors include family or personal history of suicide. In other words, if they've attempted suicide in the past or if someone in their family has attempted or committed suicide. Those who are serving their first-time convictions for violent offenses have an increased risk for suicide. Mental health disorders, particularly mood disorders such as depression or bipolar, are also indicators of a higher risk of suicide. And finally, if someone has limited social support. So if you have some inmates that you're working with that fit several of these indicators, then just know and be aware that they might be at a higher risk for attempting suicide. It is important to note that regardless of the risk factors, it's always important to be aware of the warning signs for everyone that you work with. And so here are some warning signs that research has shown that might indicate someone is contemplating suicide. First of all, if they make statements or threats to harm them or kill themselves. Secondly, if they are talking, writing, or drawing about wanting to die. If you noticed dramatic mood changes, in other words, someone who normally is very talkative, outgoing, all of a sudden becoming very recluse, very quiet, very secluded, that could be a warning sign. If someone has an inability to sleep, or on the other hand is sleeping all the time, those have been shown to be warning signs. If they begin to withdraw socially from people, another warning sign. And then finally, if they begin giving away their personal possessions, that again can be a warning sign that they might be contemplating suicide. And so finally, what are your responsibilities as a Department of Corrections volunteer regarding suicide awareness and prevention? Well, first of all, is just being aware of the risk for suicide, how much of a risk, a danger it can be for those that are incarcerated, the risk factors that might place someone at higher risk, and then the warning signs that might indicate someone is actually contemplating suicide. Communicate. Talk to inmates about it. Don't be afraid to ask the questions. Are you thinking about harming yourself? Or have you thought about suicide? And then finally, report. Even if the inmate says he doesn't want anybody to know about it, you have a responsibility to report anytime that someone indicates that they're thinking about harming themselves or, of course, harming other people. You have a responsibility to report. You must report that to the volunteer coordinator, chaplain, the facility chaplain, or security staff at that facility. And now we turn to our last topic of this training session, and that is emergency procedures. Emergency procedures tell us what to do, how to get help, or where to go in case an emergency situation develops as you're serving as a volunteer. Now, the exact procedures will vary some based upon the facility that you're serving in or the community correctional center that you're serving as a part of. So it's really important that you connect with and communicate with your facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator to know exactly what are the procedures for that facility. However, there are some general rules for emergency procedures that we want you to be aware of. The first and foremost thing is it is so important to plan in advance, to think through how you're going to respond if something goes wrong, if there's an emergency that takes place. Now, most emergencies that happen in the course of a volunteer service involve either a medical emergency or an inmate disturbance. Now, in either case, the responses are somewhat similar. In prisons, if you have a medical emergency or inmate disturbance, the first thing will be for the person you have designated as the emergency contact person. We kind of typically refer to them as the runner, but they are the person who's supposed to go get help in case of emergency. In most of our facilities, volunteers do not have access to phones or radios. And so the only way to get help is to have someone designated to go do that. And to have that plan in advance, that someone is designated to do that for your group, is so important, so you don't have to look around and think, okay, who's going to do what? To think through what each role each person's going to have. So that person that is going to be the runner, the emergency contact person, that person can leave immediately at the first sign of a medical emergency or an inmate disturbance and head to central control, because at central control is where you will always know there's going to be a correctional officer. Now, chances are, somewhere along the way, they will run into hopefully not literally, but they will come into contact with a officer, and by all means, report what's going on to the nearest officer who will be able to give you assistance. In community corrections, the important thing is to first and foremost call either 911 or the facility, depending upon the nature and the severity of the emergency. But to communicate. Secondly, is we do not want you putting yourself at risk at any time during the course of the emergency. So if it's a medical emergency, please be aware of the danger of bloodborne pathogens and diseases that can be transmitted through the blood. If someone is bleeding, unless there are emergency equipment, gloves, and that type of thing ready for you, we do not want you putting yourself at risk. If it is an inmate disturbance, we do not want you to try to break up the fight or try to separate them if it is a fight that breaks out or whatever it might be. By all means, verbally try to calm people down, de-escalate the situation, give guidance and instructions, but we do not want you putting yourself at risk. At community corrections, if an inmate, like we discussed earlier in the training, walks off, then you are to try to talk them out of leaving, but do not try to physically restrain them or try to, again, break up any kind of disturbances that might be happening. Call for assistance and directions. Another type of emergency that can happen at any given time is a tornado, a fire, or some type of other natural emergency. Now, in those cases, there'll be local procedures that will tell you where to go and what to do in case there is an emergency. First and foremost, know that security will be watching out for you. They will know, based upon the information they have on our calendars and that type of thing, where you are at the facility, and they will be coming to give you guidance, direction, and instructions. Well, congratulations. You made it through this training video. Now that we've covered all the training material, here are some final instructions on completing the annual volunteer training process. There are 3 attachments to the email that you received which had the link for this training video. Those attachments were the Volunteer Code of Conduct and Rules for Volunteer Service, a documentation of training, and a Pria form. Now, we read the Code of Conduct at the beginning of this training. The 52 rules for volunteer service were not covered word for word, but more informally. in a way that we thought would be easier to receive and to understand. However, all volunteers must abide by the Code of Conduct and Rules for Volunteer Service, and therefore, to ensure that everyone knows and understands them, we need you to take about 10 minutes and read through the rules one more time. If you have any questions about them, please contact your group leader or your primary facility chaplain volunteer coordinator. Once you have read the rules for volunteer service, you'll need to print, complete, and sign the documentation of training and the Pria form, and then return them to your primary facility chaplain volunteer coordinator. Now, as we said at the beginning of the training, there are 3 ways that you can return them to your primary facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator. That is either scanning them into a PDF and then attaching them to an email, or mailing them, making a copy of the originals and then mailing the originals to your primary facility chaplain and volunteer coordinator, or just going to the facility and hand delivering them to your primary facility chaplain and volunteer coordinator. Either way, just communicate with your primary facility chaplain and volunteer coordinator to let them know that you've completed the training and that you'll be providing them the documents and how you'll be sending it to them. Well, that's about it. If you have any questions, please contact your primary facility chaplain or volunteer coordinator. And thank you for completing this annual volunteer training, and especially for your willingness to continue making a difference as an Oklahoma Department of Corrections volunteer.